My name is Grechishkin. I'm recording the speech for the 2021 Raisbeck Aviation Tournament. The mind-numbing boredom of quarantine and the isolation caused by COVID has caused all of us to turn to new hobbies or readopt habits of the past in search of any entertainment we can get. Who hasn't seen a social media post about someone making whipped coffee, baking sourdough bread, or trying their very hardest to master the new TikTok dance? However, there's one phase that hasn't made a comeback, and yet deserves a second look. It's time we all don our polyester leisure suits and gold chains as we get ready to jungle boogie through the groovy sound of the 1970s. Disco music. By embracing disco as a form of entertainment while we attempt to avoid any Saturday night fevers during this pandemic, we can better understand its unique cultural relevance and see that you and I will survive all this hot stuff. The music we identify as disco first emerged in the early 1970s, as artists like the Monkees and the Beach Boys gradually began to be replaced by the fresh sound of groups like ABBA or the Bee Gees. Born out of exclusive, membership-only clubs throughout the US and Europe, disco flew below the radar of the general public because of its role as a reaction against the mainstream white rock groups of the time. The term disco was actually first coined all the way back in the 1940s, when venues in Paris began using turntables to play music for the first time, making some of the world's very first nightclubs to be considered discotheques. However, disco music as a style didn't emerge until the mid-1970s, when clubs in the US began playing music similar stylistically to Eurodisco. Up until this point, disco stayed out of the public eye, and the group it catered to was exclusive. But soon, mainstream insight into these secretive venues led to the disco inferno we know in the United States today. In 1971, disco was televised for the first time ever through the Soul Train music and dancing show. And after music critic Vince Aletti began attending the dance club The Loft, he became enamored with disco culture and was motivated to publish the first ever article about disco in the Rolling Stone, titled Discotheque Rock. This public exposure caused small underground clubs to grow to accommodate high-tech speakers, crowds donning their very finest platform shoes, and of course, the classic disco ball. Prior to 1970, the radio had largely ignored disco as a genre. But by the time that 1978 rolled around, there were 200 disco-only radio stations in the US alone. But from its conception, disco has fundamentally been an art form of resistance. The clubs in Europe that laid the groundwork for disco stylistically actually arose as a form of Nazi resistance when Hitler continually labeled any music created by non-white artists as a degenerate influence. This caused some of the world's very first discotheques to rise as a place where this music could be enjoyed and celebrated in peace. Even under the USSR, the influence of the discotheque was present, because even under Stalin's strict rule, dancing at disco clubs was still permitted. However, the USSR began to freak out as disco music began to be seen as subversive. Each DJ was subject to strict regulation, and the reason for the dance had to be submitted to the Communist Party before it could officially begin. There was no love train for disco. We remember jazz for the way it amplified black artists in the 1920s, rock and roll as a rebellious movement against established norms in the 60s. And when we think of disco music, we think of tacky, mass-produced, superficial music. There was no love hangover for the style, and our perception of disco as a 70s fad means we miss out on the incredible nuances of the music. To begin, the voices of the songs were more feminine, and for the first time were primarily female. And the club setting of the music meant that singers no longer had to water down their lyrics to make them radio-friendly, giving us classics like Shake Your Booty and Do You Think I'm Sexy? This marked a dramatic departure from the past, where the few songs that didn't sweep sexuality under the rug focused entirely on the desire that women created in men. But prominent female artists like Donna Summer recentered this narrative, instead focusing their music on the pleasure women derived from embracing their own sexuality and power, causing singles like Love to Love You Baby to top charts for months at a time. The empowerment disco fostered arose partially as a result of the victory second-wave feminism gained in the early 70s, with the passage of Title IX, the Roe v. Wade decision, and the ERA gaining traction. This newfound attitudes toward femininity reflected themselves in disco's fashion scene, where wrap dresses, billowy pants, and glittered sequin suits were the must-have pieces. Many feminists denounced disco fashion, labeling it as objectification of the female body. But designers and dancers alike defended their style. Much like the lyrics of the songs themselves, disco fashion was meant to be focused on empowerment for the individual, giving clubgoers the chance to choose between styles that ran the gamut from modest to revealing. Additionally, disco sparked a newfound focus on men's fashion, where men could partake in traditionally feminine styles free of judgment. Disco uniquely contributed to the empowerment of female artists as well as a more positive perception of femininity and open sexuality. And don't stop till you get enough, because disco's unique cultural blend engendered the expression of fresh Black and Latinx artists who had previously been shunned artistically by society. Disco music was rooted in funk, which came from soul and became a crucial vehicle in displaying Black culture and uplifting Black singers. Previously, music created by Black artists had been thought of as primitive by white society, but the persistent use of chanted rhythms and beats within disco music showed how Black culture was the key to disco's success. The physical space disco occupied became a symbol of equality as well. Before disco's popularity, most dancing was restricted between couple dancing between a male and a female, and dancing between two males had actually been outlawed by New York City. But disco shattered this norm and instead catered to large group dancing, where same-sex couples could dance together and enjoy the nightlife just like everybody else. Clubs like the Saint or the Vatican of disco took spaces and aesthetics that were traditionally heteronormative and turned them on their heads to create safe spaces for LGBTQ individuals to express themselves. When examining today's society, the movement has still left its mark. For starters, by pioneering the 12-inch single, disco has, in turn, led to the music we listen to today being longer, giving us all more time to act as dancing queens. Additionally, disco gave rise to DJing as a common practice. Since dance culture was the central component to disco, DJs had to use new techniques like remixing or listening ahead to capture the attention of the audience and continue to engage them. And the rhythmic undertones, synths, and repetition of the music have become mainstays and the inspiration of modern-day pop that makes you shake your groove thing. But most importantly, disco amplified the voices of artists whose society had previously overlooked and created physical space through dance that was inclusive, unique, and unlike any other. But soon, the tarnish of disco's commercialism led to its last dance. When disco became perceived as popular, it created an influx of white working-class youth into the scene, which subsequently led to the gentrification of the genre. For the most part, queer and Black artists retained their success, but small, independent record labels soon became overtaken by large corporations. As disco's audience became increasingly white and heterosexual, the disco sucks movement came to represent the pinnacle of resentment from white rock fans. Rooted in racism and homophobia, the largest known Death to Disco rally was hosted in late July of 1979. At Disco Demolition Night, fans who brought a disco record to be destroyed got a reduced ticket price to see the White Sox play, leading to a crowd of 59,000 people attending, burning records of Black and LGBTQ artists in general as well as disco music. As journalist Dave March reflected, young, white males were the most prominent group in attendance because they were the ones who felt the most threatened by the empowerment disco gave to minority groups. After Demolition Night, the mass production of disco caused the music to be seen as oversaturated and tacky, and it became aired less and less on the radio as the months went on. Today, disco will occasionally make an appearance on the radio throwback or the odd playlist. Other genres of music still get recognition for the footprint they've left on society. And yet, most of us never move beyond perceiving disco as anything but tacky or superficial, overlooking all the nuances, complexities, and special cultural value it holds. Instead, we should take a chance on meaningful disco music and see how it allows us to progress as individuals and as a society. Because once we realize that we are family, it's all a boogie wonderland.